Inverse functions and relations. Objectives. Students will be able to determine the inverse of relations and functions. Students will also be able to graph functions and their inverse. An inverse relation is when you switch the x and the y in a function. F of x is a representation of a function. F inverse of x is a representation of the inverse of that function. For example, when you're asked to calculate the inverse of a function, for instance, the equation f of x equals 3x plus 5, it would be the same thing as y equals 3x plus 5. And in order to find the inverse, you would switch your x and your y, and you would get x equals 3y plus 5. And in order to isolate your y, you would have to subtract your 5, getting x plus 5 equals 3y. And in order, once again, to isolate your y, you would have to divide by 3. And then your answer would be y equals 1/3 x minus 5 over 3. And can also be written as f inverse of x equals 1/3 x minus 5 over 3. In order to graph this, you would start off with your first equation being y equals 3x plus 5, and you would start at its y-intercept, which is 5, and then you would go up 3 over 1, mark that point, and same thing when you want to record the bottom. You would go down 3 over 1, and you would get your line. And in order to graph its inverse, you would start off with the y-intercept being negative 5 over 3, and then you would go up 1 over 3, and then that would give you your line. The y-intercept of the line would be 0, 5, and the x-intercept would be 5, 0, which is a representation of that inverse, switching your x and your y. In order to know if you have your inverse, you would see that the blue line being a representation of your y equals 3x plus 5 is a straight reflection of the line y equals x, which is how you know your function is the inverse. A harder example of an inverse function would be f of x equals x plus 3 squared minus 5, which could also be written as y equals x plus 3 squared minus 5. In order to find your inverse function, you would switch your x and your y and solve for y. In this case, you would add 5 to both sides, and it would give you x plus 5 equals y plus 3 squared. In order to undo your square, you would square root both sides, and it would give you plus or minus the square root of x plus 5 equals y plus 3. And then you would subtract 3 to both sides, and you would get negative 3 plus or minus the square root of x plus 5 equals y. And when you graph this, the black parabola is a representation of y equals x plus 3 squared minus 5. And the blue parabola is a representation of negative 3 plus or minus the square root of x plus 5. As you can tell, the initial parabola does not pass the horizontal line test due to the fact that as the horizontal line reaches the parabola, it hits the parabola twice. The fact that it's not a function. Now for a word problem, let's look at number 45. Consider the parent function y equals x squared and its inverse, y equals plus or minus the square root of x. If the graph of x squared is translated 6 units to the right and 5 units down, what must be done to the graph y equals plus or minus square root of x to get a graph of the inverse of the translated function? Write an equation for each of the translated graphs. As the word problem states, your equation would be y equals x squared. In order to demonstrate the translation 6 units up and 5 units down, you would get y equals x minus 6 squared minus 5. And in order to find its inverse, you would switch your x and your y, which would give you x equals y minus 6 squared minus 5. Then you would add your 5 to both sides, getting x plus 5 equals y minus 6 squared, and then you would square root both sides to isolate your y, and they would give you plus or minus the square root of x plus 5 equals y minus 6. Add 6 to both sides, and it would give you 6 plus or minus the square root of x plus 5 equals y, which could also be written as f inverse of x equals 6 plus or minus x plus 5. You can either graph your inverse function and your parent function by hand, or you could use a calculator. In order to use a calculator, you would go y equals, and then you would plug in your parent graph, which would be x squared, and you would scroll down and put your inverse function, and since it's 6 plus or minus the square root of x plus 5, you can't really put plus or minus in a calculator, so you would have to graph it separately. So you would put 6 plus the square root of x plus 5 on your first one. And then you would go down and graph 6 minus the square root of x plus 5. Then you would click on graph, and it should graph your three functions.